Welcome to the Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemics. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others. Hey there, welcome to The Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and learn how data can help tell stories that impact decisions to create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier. Today, we're on with Dan Eichelsdoerfer. Dan has a PhD. After a while, he ended up working in the energy sector. He moved away from the energy sector to then work for a consulting firm, did some oil and gas consulting type work, and is now the CEO of Macrocosm, one of my favorite companies out there, really cool, and have an excellent tagline, which is they're aiming to do better economics for a better world. A lot of their work builds off of the work of Don Farmer and his complexity economics and agent-based modeling work in the past. And I think what they're doing is really important, not only for the field of agent-based modeling, but for the tagline, in better understanding the world to make a difference. And if the economy's better, it's also better for more people. So really glad to have Dan on the podcast today. Dan, why don't you give our listeners a little about yourself and your current role?
Yeah, thanks, John, and I'm happy to be here. So as you mentioned in your intro, I came to Macrocosm through a bit of an unusual and winding path. I started with undergrad in physics, PhD in chemistry. While I was in the graduate lab studying nanolithography, which is what my PhD was in, I became really concerned about climate change and making a difference there. So I decided to work after my PhD to work in the oil and gas sector with the idea that I would make a difference by working within some of the largest energy firms, on the planet. I worked for ExxonMobil for several years. After a few years there, I decided that I wanted to get a bit more experience simultaneously on the business and operations side of things, as well as getting more exposure to the electricity sector and understanding how it worked. So I went into management consulting. I was at BCG for 6.5, almost 7 years. And then I was frankly presented with the opportunity to work with Macrocosm. I started doing a little bit of it, collaborating with them at BCG, talked to Don quite a few times, became really convinced of his vision and the impact that it could make. And so I decided to join Macrocosm as the CEO to help drive the change that Don and now we are envisioning.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the team at Macrocosm to start. So there's Don. He's been doing complexity economics for a long time. Probably coined the term complexity economics himself, right? So yeah, like who else is involved in Macrocosm so far? What are some of the early use cases that you guys are really excited about?
Yeah, so I am really excited by the team, both on an interpersonal level, but also just on an intellectual level. We have working with us several of Don's former graduate students and or postdocs, who are kind of a mixture of physicists and economists and mathematicians. And one of them actually has a strong background in machine learning. So we have a really nice combination of modeling in physics and economics and ways to bring machine learning to bear on all of those. And then complementing these full-time researchers, we're also working with three professors that are advising us part-time. And those professors are themselves part of Don's ecosystem of collaborators. All of them worked with Don in the past, either as a student or a postdoc. And they are both driving academic research in their own way, and also advising us on ways to make this complexity economics, ways to make our models much better.
Yeah. I remember a similar time in the epistemics life cycle where,
Hmm.
the composition of the team, very research heavy, highly academic, kind of consider that part of the glory days of just like so many good ideas coming up. Um, what's it like for you kind of leading this team where you have different people coming at modeling from their own respective domains? Is it fun? Are there heated debates? Are they lively? When we're talking about modeling an energy system from the bottom up, like that's a pretty big deal. So yeah, what are those conversations like within the team?
Yeah, I love it. It is Glory Days is a very good way to capture it. It feels I've joked with this with my partner several times already. It feels like the glory days of graduate school again, where it's a bunch of really smart intellectuals and everyone has really good ideas and we debate ideas in a very robust manner. I would say it's a challenge, but one that I really enjoy because I truly do think the best science and the best products that come out of said scientific research come from interdisciplinary collaborations. I really think it's, you know, the boundaries between fields and people coming from different disciplines that bring the best out of everyone. And I think it's both better, I think, from a creative standpoint, as well as it it forces you as like a specialist in your field to explain yourself, I think, in a little bit more detail and less in a less jargonistic manner than you might be used to. And I actually think that has a useful clarifying function on your own thoughts because you can't, if you're a physicist, you can't just explain things to another physicist. You might have to explain it to an economist or a machine learning engineer. And I think that's actually quite powerful. And so for me, I enjoy leading and being part of these conversations. I do think you're right that sometimes um, it doesn't get I don't think any of it ever gets difficult from an interpersonal perspective. I do think there are often debates that are what's the best way to crack X or Y? What's the best way to model this? And that I think that's healthy. I also think the team does a pretty good job, and Doan is quite visionary in this respect. The team does a good job of sort of airing out and debating for a while, and then taking a step back and saying, "Hold on, what is pragmatic? What do we actually need to do to capture the essential behavior rather than modeling everything to, what I think of as like the fifth or the sixth decimal place?" So I think it's helpful in some ways to have that debate and then to sort of take a pause and say, all right, we're going to do X and Y. And if that doesn't work, we'll come back and maybe we need to refine the models and try someone else's approach. But so far, it's been very productive and collaborative, I would say.
Yeah, love the one of my favorite authors. This guy Stephen Johnson. He does some like pop science books. He calls that the adjacent possible
Hmm.
when
Hmm.
you're literally just at, you know, right on the edge, applying your, insight, background, expertise, apply it somewhere else, and next thing you know, you could have a pretty groundbreaking thing. So, uh, before we get into more macrocosm things, let's chat about Dan for a little bit. So, what got you into like complex systems and being interested in sort of like the science of modeling and understanding the world? And that could have been pre-PhD time, or could have been something that flipped when you kind of started working at macrocosm with complexity economics.
So I'd say it was a tale of a few chapters in my life, and the start was actually before my PhD. My sophomore year in undergrad, I had a physics professor whose job it was to teach us math methods. So the idea of this course was to he had a phrase that was I'm here to teach your wrists to do physics. And it was meant to be like computational methods that would be useful in quantum mechanics and electrodynamics, etc. And this particular professor had a uh, bit of an obsession, I would say, with chaos and complexity. And so we took a 2 or 3 week detour during a semester into Lorenz, weather modeling, the whole history of strange attractors, bifurcation plots, and all of those kinds of questions. And I'll be honest, like I was fascinated by it. This was the mid 2000s, so I was simultaneously fascinated by it and also, to be honest, like, okay, this is cute. What's it useful for? Like, sure, whether I see that, and I get I get the research that Lorenz did, but I cellular automata, great. Loved Stephen Wolfram's work, all of that stuff. But again, it was hard for me to see the practical applications. And I'll be honest, it was fascinating. And then my studies went on. I went into chemistry and moved away from physics a little bit. And it wasn't until I was several years into my career at BCG, so probably 7 or 8 years into the working world, when I started to really be concerned with how important it was to think from a truly systems level when it came to the energy, well, system. It's a problem that is being attacked from a lot of different angles and a lot of different silos and specialist viewpoints. But I really got the sense that there was a holistic or systematic lens missing. And so that started some wheels turning. And it was actually part of a research project I was doing at BCG while part of a think tank, an internal think tank, when we were trying to do some of this modeling and think about the energy transition from a systematic perspective, that I started reading about and came across Doan's work, happened to be a partner at BCG who knew Doan on a personal level through the Santa Fe Institute. And I started to get really excited. It was one of those, a spark reignites something that had long been dormant. And I realized not only can I now see the use case or see the application of chaos, complex systems, nonlinear dynamics, but I also realized that several things had changed in the interim since I had last visited complexity almost 2 decades ago from an academic perspective. One, computing power had advanced considerably. And two, the in general, the modeling community in complex systems had just made a lot of progress, both in terms of techniques and methodologies, but also in terms of behavioral understanding and drawing from psychology and sociology and really embedding those in agents' behaviors. And that aspect of it felt a lot more rudimentary when I first learned about it in my undergrad studies. And doing a bit of a fast forward and reading up about it again a couple of years ago, I had a series of these aha moments where I said, "Oh wait, I really do think this is ready for prime time." And then the more I talked to Doan to see like, am I misreading this? Am I misunderstanding it? Is it actually further away than I think? He confirmed that hypothesis, and he too felt that it was ready for prime time. And in fact, this is how the conversation started of him saying, "I think it's already for prime time. I've started a company to do this."
That's awesome. So I want to go into a couple of things there. We're going to
Of course.
talk about aha moments later on. We're
Okay.
also going to talk
Okay.
about um, maybe this was something at Exxon or something at BCG where you might have said like, oh, this is kind of a what the flux type moment. If we could go back and rethink or remodel that, that would be great. Uh, what's it like when you're trying to like do modeling, do some innovative things? Like you had that experience at Exxon, you've done it within a think tank, within one of the premier consulting firms globally, and now you're doing it in your own startup company. Um, what are the pros and cons of trying to innovate within those three environments? Because I think a lot of our listeners, they might be in a consulting firm or at a think tank or might even be at a big company. And they're like, okay, these startups, like, how do they come up with these ideas? How are they getting to market so quick? It'd be great to, have the listeners hear your perspective on what it's like working on innovation type teams in those three different environments.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this quite a lot since joining Macrocosm, and there's fewer differences than I think I expected initially. And what I mean by that is what you're with any sort of innovative project or product or set of ideas, you're always trying to in short, like, get yourself enough money to keep doing the research and the innovation. And it's really just a question of who you're convincing to get the money, to give you the money. And of course, the money is exchanged for services, right? But there's, within a large corporate like Exxon, you which has a actually a very robust R&D process, and um ExxonMobil Research and Engineering. It may be called something else now, but that's what it was called at the time. It had several thousand researchers in it, and had a long and storied history. But it had its own peculiarities of, it takes a long time to unlock funding, and it tends to be very internally risk averse, especially if you're trying to do anything that is outside the core business, which everyone, yes, recognizes as important for the long-term health of the company, but it's not the day-to-day quarterly profit driven. That motive is hard to get around. But so you sort of figure that out, and then at a consulting firm, the pace is a lot faster than it is in, at least in my experience, which has pros and cons to it. You feel like you can make a lot more progress, but it also places increased demands on your literally your speed to output, right? Which is not just a buzzword within a lot of the consulting firms, increase your speed to output, but it's also something that becomes a real research challenge. And I think on the bad side, you wind up leaving good ideas on the table that maybe would have come to fruition with just a bit more time. On the positive side, you get a lot more pragmatic about getting results quickly and getting them good enough, right? Not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. So I think consulting firms and innovating within one can be good for that. The other thing it's quite good at is getting you used to that, what's often called this agile or lean startup methodology of build something quickly, build an MVP, get feedback. That's actually endemic to the way that a lot of these large strategy consulting firms operate internally. So that's also something that is nice about trying to innovate within them, is you are often, unconsciously or not, using methods that a lot of startups use. So now at Macrocosm, just to finish the thread here, I I really appreciate having, of course, more autonomy than either of those previous two places. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that the autonomy of a less than 10 person organization is much higher than that of a, 80,000 person organization like ExxonMobil, or I think BCG is up to 30K now, and thereabouts. So it's nice to have a lot more autonomy, but you still face some of the same fundamental, I'll call them survival challenges of needing to get money from investors, needing to get money from clients, and always doing a little bit of meeting in the middle when it comes to what are my customers' needs versus what are the both intellectually interesting problems to solve to keep the researcher satisfied, and also the problems that we need to solve that will cut across multiple customers and multiple products. So in a way, the specifics of the challenges wind up being different, but that fundamental, you're always fighting to secure funding, actually that really hasn't stopped at all.
Makes a ton of sense. I think a lot of people listening in can identify and that'll resonate with them a lot.
Mhm.
Want to talk about something that I feel like we both go through in leading agent-based modeling-based companies. Um, and that's like, how do you get over some like older held beliefs about how something should get modeled, or, well, we've done the math this way for years. Why should we change anything now? Like, I'm in a job that I still get paid for to do the same thing, and like, what's the cost to not innovate? So within the energy sector, what is the type of modeling that's going on today? Where does your modeling complement that? And like, how big of an innovation are we really talking about with what macrocosm has the potential to do? Which I believe is a lot, but would be, want to hear it from you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and unsurprisingly one I think about a lot. So I think from there are some kinds of modeling in the electricity system and oil and gas that have a long history and are very well understood, and there are lots of players and or competitors in that space. So when you think about, say, power flow modeling, or energy, like grid topology optimization, or how to optimize like where certain plants will go in order to get the physics of the grid to be optimal at least cost, right? These types of optimization models are widespread. Lots of utilities use them. There's a lot of engineering that goes into them. But one thing that they are often missing, and I think most modelers within utilities and other energy companies would admit this, one thing that's missing is that more integrated one level up view of two things. One, what happens outside of your company or outside of your service territory, and what happens from a more economic perspective. What does, rather than being, because a lot of these energy companies, for understandable and I think good reasons, are very grounded in their own physical assets and making money from their generating stations or from the poles and wires or from the oil and gas fields or from the midstream, assets that they own. But there's usually, I think, less attention paid to the prices and demand and how, supply, demand, prices, all of that impacts their own profitability. And I think it's because doing so requires, if you ask why or what do I need to model enough times, you very quickly back yourself into modeling not just your whole company, but your whole country, actually the entire world, actually not just electricity, but also oil and gas. And so one example I like to use for me that helps crystallize it is when I think back to 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, and then the gas supply to much of Europe, especially Germany, is cut off, and gas prices spike, natural gas prices spike, they go through the roof. I think there's some first order impacts there that, while no one, well, I'd argue no one maybe outside of, Putin's inner circle could have foreseen the invasion of Ukraine. I think if you said something like, "Oh, what happens if Russian gas supplies are cut off to Germany?" There are lots of models that could have told you what would happen, and it would lead to gas price spikes. You'd see higher volatility. I don't think that's too hard to see. I think what is with existing models and, sets of tools, I think what's harder to see is the impact on somewhere like Australia, where Australian gas prices spiked, and it was because of a complicated interplay between export dynamics into Asian gas markets and versus the cost of self-consumption within Australia, and the fact that Australia produces a lot of natural gas, but then when the export markets for LNG became so much more attractive economically, i.e., the prices were higher, Australian gas producers could make a lot more money, not by serving Australia, but by exporting to foreign markets. So there's this like second and I'd argue third order effect that the European gas crisis had on Australian gas prices and Australian electricity prices as a result that would have been much harder to see coming. And it's, there's a lot going in there, right? There's the increasingly global nature of gas markets, which used to be regionalized. There's the fact that gas often sets the price of electricity. And so shocks within the gas market become shocks in the electricity market. If you want, like, gas becomes a vector through which energy price shocks can spread in unexpected ways. Those are things that require modeling the energy system, electricity, gas, and oil, in a way that no one does today. And that's where I think macrocosms models can really shine, is capturing those types of interconnected dynamics.
So, a lot of folks that listen to the podcast familiar with agent-based modeling. What other modeling approaches and techniques or do you have to add other things into these agent-based models, or you're purely starting from like an agent-based system that's able to capture all of this?
We are purely starting from an agent-based modeling framework or system. I do
Mhm.
think we expect to add other modeling techniques to our toolkit, for lack of a better way to put it. And don't get me wrong, we still we'll run econometrics type models on the side as a way to check, and sometimes they become actually very good. I'd call them V zeros of some of our models, right? You can get a very, very coarse-grained answer, and which can also give you a good way to check some of the outputs of your agent-based models, right? Because a problem with agent-based models is that it convincing yourself that you're getting the right behavior or the expected behavior, it's very easy to get yourself caught up in a bunch of assumptions and biases. And I think this is well known to all practitioners. I'm of course not knocking the field. I'm just pointing out that this is a common problem. And so we'll sometimes use sort of basic statistical models or econometrics to check or to provide a sense check for some of the the outputs of our ABMs. We also do envision using, especially with the agents themselves, we envision borrowing techniques from, deep learning, reinforcement learning, and those sorts of, what I'll broadly call machine learning techniques to not just make the agents, not just to have the agents make active inference, but also potentially as a way to make the agents more realistic by, say, training them on data from the companies, the firms that we're simulating. So in other words, imagine this is a sort of cutesy toy example, but if you can imagine telling an LLM, here is 50 years of financial data on, EDP or on ExxonMobil or on Total. Now behave in the simulation as if you were that company using all of their, financial statements, annual reports, etc. Um, I think that's a bit down the road. For now, we really are using 80, 90% plus agent-based models.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, um, we usually try to like talk about, what are some novel areas where modeling can go, specifically agent-based modeling. In bringing up these other techniques, though, makes me think like, what do you think? What has held agent-based modeling back over time compared to some of these other techniques? And you talked about it a little bit earlier on. Computing power, that's one thing. Maybe more data that's available.
Yeah,
Uh,
microdata, sure, yeah.
yeah. What about like thinking in systems or thinking about like how to like build models? Like, where does that come in? Who solves that? What are some of the other barriers that you see for agent-based modeling to get adopted? And again, we're on this podcast trying to make agent-based modeling more and more relevant to different
Yeah.
fields. Um, and just trying to understand like what are some of the challenges that the field needs to overcome before, somebody else is talking about the next new thing. And they're like, oh yeah, reinforcement learning, agent-based modeling, neural nets, and so on. How does agent-based modeling become one of like the categorical, every company has to be doing this stuff?
Yeah. Also a very good question. And I'll admit that I obviously have a lot less background in this area than some of your uh, previous guests and also than your listeners. But maybe that's, I'll pretend to spin that as an advantage that it gives me more beginner's eyes here.
Definitely an advantage in this sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I so for me there are two other things that stand out. Yeah, data, compute, all of that I think is a bit easier to get your head around. Um, I think the first point I'll make is around it's sort of a combination of systems thinking and honestly just explaining agent-based modeling and what it does and how it works in a way that is comprehensible. And I say this with, with a positive, attitude and like all good intentions, but a lot of explanations of agent-based models and complexity economics are difficult to get through. And I say this as someone who has a background that is well suited to understanding it. And so I think to be honest, like I do think there's a communication barrier to be overcome. And I don't think this is something we have to get perfect, right? Like if we're being honest, AI and machine learning didn't conquer all of their communication, for lack of a better way to put it, issues. There's still many concepts in deep learning and reinforcement learning that I think the broader public does not understand. But I do think that field, and there are a number of other historical contingencies here, but I think that field did still have more. I think there's still more explanatory power there. Or explanatory power is the wrong word. There are better explanations, and the understanding is a bit better than it is still with agent-based models. And I think they can get there because in some ways, I think agent-based modeling is actually quite intuitive. It just needs to be explained in enough different ways that are comprehensible to, the general public. I also think there is. I do think there's a bit of a missing aha moment or a Sputnik moment, if you were, or to use the deep learning analogy, an AlexNet moment. For some of your listeners who were around back in 2012, I was a graduate student, and I remember, and to be clear, I was not studying, reinforcement learning or deep learning at all, but I remember seeing that image recognition algorithm destroy the rest of the competition. And for those who aren't familiar with AlexNet, uh, Google it. You'll find a good Wikipedia page. It was a very, very fascinating chapter, and it really flipped the switch for convincing people that machine learning was valuable. And I think agent-based modeling I think there are some good examples out there, but nothing that's made it to the public consciousness yet in the same way. And I think there's a and then I think there's it's a related point that is it's distinct but related to this explainability issue, which is I also think that systems and how to analyze and think in that manner is difficult. It's really hard. And I think there's this, you sort of have to challenge yourself to constantly broaden the scope of what you consider to be the system. And there's people often get very good at thinking within the system of their own field or their own problem or their own niche, but then you have to do sort of, at least for me, I have to do 3 or 4 steps back or broadening of the aperture, if you will, before I really start to see the interconnections and the things that aren't clear. And I feel like I'm someone who has been trying consciously to get better at this for more than a decade and will probably struggle for decades to get better at this. And I would love there to be better pedagogy and better teaching and education in universities about this. I don't, honestly, I've been out of academia for so long, I don't know if it's there, but I would love to see more of that. And I think it will be hard in academia just because of how deep the silos are and how high the returns are to specialization in academia, for better or for worse. But I do think having that thinking would be something that is really important for understanding and articulating the impact of ABMs and complexity science.
Yeah, without a doubt. So we both have ties into the Santa Fe Institute. Are there other groups out there that are sort of the conveners of this multidisciplinary thinking that helps? And I think using the term like just broaden the aperture, like that is effectively what great modelers do. They go broad and then they can simplify and look for these, common things of behavior. But yeah, outside of the Santa Fe Institute, where else, are the great thinkers in this area or other teams that you might want to call out that you've been able to work with?
I think um I think two of the other big hubs that have been really helpful are, of course, Oxford and the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Um, that's Doan's group, and Francois Lafond and others are there. So I think they are really leading the charge in the UK. And I also think the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, CSH, is another good gathering of these types of thinkers. Um, there there may be others, and again, this is where I don't have the deep knowledge that a lot of your listeners I'm sure do, but those are really the only two examples besides the Santa Fe Institute that come to mind, are the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna and Oxford's INET.
Cool. We'll have to give a couple more shout outs to those teams. All right. You have time for maybe one or two more questions. So one of my favorite questions I get to ask on the podcast is what the flux moment that if you could rewind the clock, go back, be able to simulate that scenario in a number of different ways, the decisions, what the future possibilities would look like, what would be a moment either in your life or in world history even that you would want to go back to and say, all right, let's rewind the clock, hop into the flux capacitor or the DeLorean, flux capacitor takes you all the way back and you're there at that decision moment. What would one of those be for you?
I would. I had an answer, and then you mentioned about going back at any time in history. And so now I'm going to change slightly. So I would go back to the 70s and 80s in the aftershocks of the Arab oil embargo. And that was a time when the United States and Western Europe were particularly concerned with securing their future of their own energy supply in a manner that was independent from the oil and gas that was largely coming out of the Middle East at the time. And there's a lot of geopolitics and history that are fascinating, but I'll skip over for brevity. Um, because what I would have loved to be able to simulate is at that time, what if the world, and specifically the major consumers of oil and gas at the time, but what if the world as a whole looked holistically at what could we do? Because solar and wind technology were known, batteries were known then, and and of course hydroelectricity was, and dams and storing water in behind a dam. All of these technologies were known. Yes, of course they were very expensive, especially solar, but if we could have had the modeling to say, if we seriously address energy efficiency, and if we look into scaling up solar, wind, and batteries in a very substantial way and watch them fall down these cost curves, right? Learning by doing, Wright's law, what would Moore's law hadn't been coined yet at the time, but it's a similar version of this. But if we'd been able to simulate the impacts of making major investments in variable renewables, and frankly in nuclear too, because I think nuclear could have gone down a very different path. But if we could have used that moment to fundamentally reevaluate how we generated electricity with the foresight to understand how deploying more technology makes it cheaper and better, I think we could be living in a very different world right now. And to be honest, I'm not even sure we'd be worried about climate change, because I think we could have, in the 70s and 80s, we had enough time. And maybe it wouldn't feel existential the way it was today. It would be more of like, oh, we're at zero point 0.8 degrees warming now above pre-industrial average, and we need to get back down, rather than where we are now, which is beyond 1.5 degrees, and like 2 degrees Celsius feels like it's around the corner. So that's what I would do, is to be able to have these sorts of simulation techniques and this foresight into the energy system. I'd go
Hmm.
back to just after the Arab oil embargo, when the world was when again, I'm sorry, the developed world was really reevaluating critically how it consumed energy, because I think it could have made a huge difference.
Dan, is that true today? And this is where part of the quest for macrocosm is to kind of look at the whole energy system. Like, is energy still one of the major ways that this type of modeling could have a massive global impact?
Yes,
Is cool. And
yes,
this is what macrocosm is gonna help us solve. Heck yeah, this is great.
yep.
Uh, so I want to connect our podcast back with Doan's. A term that he kept using a lot was sustainability, and talking about the impact of models. I think you're also a very impact-driven character.
Mhm.
Like, for sustainability purposes, like, where do you see the value prop of modeling in the name of sustainability? How does that play out for you, and how do you think that's going to play out for macrocosm in the next decade?
So for me, I think I think right now we're at an interesting um, you know, turning point, or a you know, where we are I do think there's a lot of capital that is eager to be invested in sustainable solutions, but I also think there's a lot of uncertainty, because I think there's uncertainty. I mean, there's a number of drivers, of course, and reasons for there, to be uncertainty in the world. But I think there's fundamentally one of the biggest uncertainties is where, if I'm going to invest money, where can I put it to both maximize my returns and, drive sustainability, drive sustainable solutions. And there's a bewildering number of options. Is it solar? Is it wind? Is it long duration energy storage? If it's long duration energy storage, what kind is it? Is it geothermal? Is it new nuclear? If it's new nuclear, what about fusion, right? You can, honestly, if you're an investor, you can drive yourself crazy trying to think about all of the options you have to maximize your long-term returns. So I think there's, for investors who are uncertain about where to put their capital to maximize returns, we're building the tools that will help them make those decisions with greater clarity. Because I have a strong hypothesis that a lot of capital is tied up because of uncertainty. And if agent-based models can even improve that, reduce that uncertainty by 10%, then that could dramatically accelerate the energy transition and, sustainability. And I think I'm sure Doan mentioned this, but we view it as going beyond energy. I think energy is a great place to start. I
Mhm.
think there's a near-term need for it, but ultimately this applies to everywhere in the world economy. And I think we could use this to not just address, emissions from energy, but also ultimately emissions from heavy industry, from heating and cooling, from agriculture, and beyond that to other questions that have long plagued humanity, like inequality. So I really do see this as being very powerful for sustainability in the next 5 to 10 years, but also for a number of other problems that are at the systems level and that have proven very difficult for humans to address.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I'm glad to be on this journey with you and find ways to make agent-based modeling have the impact that I believe we both believe it can have, tackling these big systemic challenges for a number of the societal environment and other issues. So, Dan, it was great having you on the podcast. Thank you so much. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about Macrocosm, where should they go?
Good question. They should feel free to email us at info@macrocosm.group or go to our LinkedIn page. And, I and others are monitoring the LinkedIn page for any messages. So both of those are great ways to get in touch with us.
Awesome. We'll add that on. And for all the listeners, again, on with Dan, CEO of Macrocosm. They're doing great work. Definitely reach out. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you having me.
Mhm.